The thick jungle surrounding Taivu Point on Guadalcanal pressed in from all sides as Lieutenant Genjiro Imai of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company made entries in his personal diary on that August day in 1942, the 19th to be precise. Palm fronds blocked most sunlight while vines choked the spaces between trees, creating an oppressive green twilight that would have unnerved less experienced soldiers. Imai and 916 others had just completed a nighttime landing from destroyers, their insertion executed with the precision that Japanese naval forces had perfected over months of Pacific operations. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki commanded this detachment, and he carried with him absolute confidence born from intelligence reports that painted American forces as numbering perhaps 2,000 men at most, poorly trained and likely to break under determined assault. The Americans were soft, or so the briefings had claimed, products of comfortable lives who lacked the spiritual fortitude and martial discipline that defined Japanese warriors. Ichiki himself had brushed aside suggestions that he wait for additional forces before launching his assault, dismissing such caution with observations that these were merely Americans who would be driven into the ocean before the sun rose again. None among these veterans, hardened through campaigns across China and throughout Southeast Asia, could have anticipated what awaited them in the coming hours. They were about to experience something unprecedented in their military careers, something that went far beyond simple defeat. The Imperial Japanese Army had tasted nothing but victory since operations began in China during 1937. Building a reputation for invincibility that seemed confirmed with each successive triumph. What lay ahead was not merely losing a battle, but rather witnessing the complete dismantling of every tactical principle, every strategic assumption, every ideological certainty that formed the foundation of Japanese military doctrine. The jungle that had always served as an ally to infiltrating forces would turn traitor. Darkness, which Japanese troops had owned and exploited since the war's beginning, would become an accomplice to their destruction. American superiority in equipment, coordination, and raw destructive power would prove so overwhelming that the myth of Japanese dominance in close-quarters fighting would shatter like glass. The transformation had actually started 2 weeks prior, on the 7th day of August, when 11,000 United States Marines belonging to the 1st Marine Division came ashore at Lunga Point. General Alexander Vandergrift led these leathernecks in executing Operation Watchtower, marking the first offensive action Americans had undertaken in the Pacific Theater. Their mission appeared straightforward when viewed on maps and in planning documents. Capture the Japanese airfield that sat nearly completed, establish defensive positions around the perimeter, maintain that position until relief arrived. Reality would prove vastly different, as these Marines were beginning a campaign that would become the longest and most savage in their Corps' history to that point, fought in an environment that pushed human endurance to absolute breaking points. The island itself resembled Paradise's cruel mockery. Guadalcanal stretched 90 miles in length and 25 miles across at its widest, with mountains rising 8,000 feet into clouds that never seemed to dissipate, dominating the interior. The coastal plain where Henderson Field would be established consisted of kunai grass interspersed with swamp and jungle growth so dense that a man might see only a few feet ahead. Heat suffocated everyone, with humidity locked perpetually above 90%. Mosquitoes didn't merely swarm, but formed clouds thick enough that men breathed them in with every breath. Rivers and streams that appeared clear and safe in aerial reconnaissance photographs teemed with microscopic threats, parasites and disease vectors waiting to infect anyone foolish enough to drink untreated water. Malaria would eventually incapacitate soldiers on both sides. Dengue fever struck without warning. Dysentery became universal. Tropical ulcers ate through flesh. Disease would disable more men than bullets and shells combined before the campaign ended. That first morning brought unexpected fortune to the invading Marines, who discovered the airfield defended by a relative handful of troops. 2,200 Japanese construction personnel and 600 naval infantry fled into the jungle interior, abandoning not merely equipment and supplies, but the airfield itself, the very strategic asset their nation needed to control this region. By the time darkness fell on August 8th, American engineers were already working to complete the runway. They christened it Henderson Field, naming it after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had fallen at Midway. Within days, the first aircraft would touch down on that strip, beginning the operations of what history would remember as the Cactus Air Force. Japan's response came swift and proved catastrophic for American naval forces operating offshore. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa commanded 7 cruisers and a single destroyer through darkness on the night of August 9th in a surprise attack executed with brilliant tactical precision. The Battle of Savo Island would enter the record books as the United States Navy's worst defeat in history. 4 heavy cruisers went to the bottom in less than 60 minutes. USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and the Australian ship HMAS Canberra all sank in flames. Over 1,000 sailors perished in burning waters. Allied naval forces that survived withdrew, taking with them the majority of supplies that remained unloaded on the beaches. The Marines found themselves isolated, cut off, facing an enemy certain to reinforce while they possessed barely half their planned equipment and provisions. What Japanese high command failed to grasp during those early August days was Henderson Field's significance, how that single airfield had become the fulcrum upon which everything else balanced. Whoever controlled that runway controlled the surrounding waters during daylight. Aircraft flying from Henderson could strike any Japanese vessel operating within 200 miles. This singular fact would dictate the campaign's entire character and determine every strategic decision both sides made in the months ahead. Japanese forces could dominate nighttime operations, running troops and supplies on fast destroyer runs that Americans dubbed the Tokyo Express. But when dawn broke and sunlight returned, American aircraft ruled the skies absolutely. Strategic necessity demanded that Japan recapture Henderson Field immediately before American forces could strengthen their positions and establish proper defenses. Imperial General Headquarters assigned the mission to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army, currently based at Rabaul. Hyakutake's available forces were limited. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade sat at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment remained in the Philippines. The nearest unit was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, positioned near Guam after being reassigned from the Midway operation that had been cancelled following June's naval disaster. Colonel Ichiki had built his reputation as an infantry school instructor, recognized as a first-rate tactician. He was also known for impulsiveness and for placing supreme confidence in Japanese fighting spirit over American material advantages. Before departing Truk-bound for Guadalcanal, Ichiki received explicit orders to wait for his regiment's remaining elements before attempting to retake the airfield. Ichiki possessed minimal respect for American soldiers, having thoroughly studied reports from China, from the Philippines, from every location where Japanese forces had encountered Western troops. They lacked discipline in his assessment. They broke under sustained pressure. They could not match Japanese warriors when fighting shifted to close quarters with bayonets and grenades. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers delivered 917 men belonging to Ichiki's first element to Taivu Point, 15 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing proceeded smoothly, undetected by American observation. Ichiki immediately dispatched reconnaissance patrols to assess enemy strength and identify defensive positions, a routine tactical procedure that would ultimately prove fatal. August 19th brought contact when a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, commanded by Captain Charles Brush, moved along the coastal track toward Coley Point and spotted Japanese soldiers. The two forces collided in a brief, savage firefight that left 31 Japanese soldiers dead. More critically, documents captured from the bodies revealed a significant enemy force's presence in the area. These papers also demonstrated that Japanese intelligence had severely underestimated American strength. Captain Brush raced back to the perimeter with his intelligence haul. General Vandergrift immediately understood the implications. A Japanese attack was coming, soon, probably from the east, probably targeting the sandbar at what Marines called the Tenaru River, though it was actually the Ilu River, a misidentification that would persist in all subsequent historical accounts. Vandergrift ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to strengthen defences along the riverbank. Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines along the river, positioning machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire across the sandbar. What followed would become one of the most lopsided battles in Marine Corps history. Colonel Ichiki, rather than waiting for intelligence about his missing patrol or for reinforcements to arrive, decided to attack immediately. On the night of August 20th, extending into the early morning hours of August 21st, he ordered a frontal assault directly across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine emphasized spiritual power's superiority and the effectiveness of aggressive night attacks to overcome enemy firepower advantages. Ichiki believed his veterans could breach American defenses through pure audacity and close-quarters fighting where Japanese soldiers excelled. Just after midnight, Solomon Islands scout Jacob Voser, who had escaped Japanese captivity after enduring hours of torture, stumbled into Marine lines with a warning that the Japanese were coming. Minutes afterward, the attack commenced. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, screaming battle cries, firing rifles, hurling grenades. They ran directly into a prepared killing zone the Marines had established with methodical precision. M1917. A 1 Browning water-cooled machine guns opened fire. These weapons, perfected during the First World War, were unsung heroes of Marine firepower. Each gun could sustain 600 rounds per minute indefinitely provided the water jacket stayed filled and ammunition remained available. Marines had positioned them in mutually supporting positions, ensuring no area of the sandbar remained uncovered by overlapping fire. Japanese soldiers fell in waves as heavy .30 caliber rounds tore through flesh and bone. Those who managed to cross the sandbar encountered 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, essentially giant shotgun shells that transformed men into shredded meat. The attack continued for hours, wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charging into machine gun fire. Some reached Marine positions and engaged in hand-to-hand combat, where Marines fought with rifles, knives, fists, anything available. But defensive preparations held. Interlocking fields of fire prevented any Japanese breakthrough. As dawn approached, Colonel Ichiki's attack had completely stalled. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in shallow water. Daybreak brought no relief for surviving Japanese forces. General Vandergrift ordered a counterattack using elements from 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, supported by 5 M3 Stuart light tanks that crossed the sandbar and began systematically hunting down Japanese soldiers who had taken cover in coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis, observing from a Marine position, described watching the tanks bustling amongst trees, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. He realized there were far more Japanese in the grove than anyone had suspected, as group after group were flushed out and shot down by the tank's canister shells. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru had ended. Of 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, approximately 800 were dead. Roughly 128 survivors, mostly from support units that had remained near the landing site, melted into the jungle. They would send a radio message to the 17th Army headquarters reporting the disaster. Colonel Ichiki numbered among the dead, though accounts differ regarding how he died. Official Japanese versions claimed he burned his regimental colours and committed ritual suicide. Some witnesses insisted he died leading a final charge. Marine casualties approximated 40 killed and wounded. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese soldiers was devastating. Captured documents and post-war accounts revealed shock at learning an entire regiment had been annihilated in a single night. Americans had not fought as Japanese doctrine predicted. They did not panic when attacked at night. They did not break when charged by screaming warriors. Instead, they had waited in prepared positions, allowed Japanese forces to enter killing zones, then systematically destroyed them with concentrated firepower. The most devastating revelation came from examining captured equipment and assessing the battlefield. Americans possessed material wealth that Japanese intelligence had completely failed to comprehend. Browning machine guns never jammed, never overheated beyond designed capacity, never failed from poor maintenance or inadequate spare parts. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad possessed. Artillery support that Marines could summon exceeded anything Japanese forces could deploy. The coordination between infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire from ships offshore represented an integrated system of destruction that Japanese forces had never encountered in their previous campaigns. Within days of the Tenaru disaster, additional Japanese forces were already en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a massive naval operation to support the next attempt to retake Henderson Field. 3 slow transport ships departed Truk on August 16th, carrying the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Ichiki's regiment plus 500 naval infantry. After the naval battle of the Eastern Solomons resulted in heavy damage to one transport, Japanese command decided to abandon slow transport ships entirely. Instead, they would employ destroyers for what became known as Tokyo Express runs. Between August 29th and September 4th, various destroyers and light cruisers delivered almost 5,000 troops from Major General Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express functioned brilliantly as a method for moving men. Destroyers could complete the round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in a single night, minimizing exposure to American air attack. But the method possessed a critical weakness. Heavy equipment could not be transported this way. Artillery pieces, tanks, trucks, and most importantly adequate food and ammunition had to be left behind. This logistical reality would ultimately doom every Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Soldiers arrived with only what they could carry on their backs. They depended on local foraging and whatever supplies could be infiltrated through American lines. As the campaign wore on, Japanese troops would find themselves fighting not merely against American firepower, but against starvation itself. General Kawaguchi established September 12th as the date for his assault on Henderson Field. His plan called for a 3-pronged attack. One force would strike from the west along coastal areas. A second force would attack from the south, penetrating through dense jungle to strike what Japanese intelligence believed was the weakest point in American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort from the south, approaching along an inland ridge that dominated Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi did not know was that Marine intelligence had already identified this ridge as the most likely avenue of approach for any major attack from that direction. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the 1st Raider Battalion, conducted a raid on Tasimboko village on September 8th and discovered massive supply dumps indicating a large Japanese force was concentrating in the area. Edson immediately understood the Japanese plan. They would come from the south, using the ridge as their approach route. He requested permission to establish a defensive line along the ridge. General Vandergrift approved. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned approximately 840 Marines from his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge. He selected defensive positions with the same methodical care that had characterized Tenaru defenses. Machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fire. Mortar crews registered on likely approach routes. Artillery from the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions. Every advantage of terrain and firepower was calculated and prepared. The ridge itself consisted of a narrow coral spine, approximately 1,000 meters long, comprising 3 distinct hills covered with kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep ravines bordered both sides, heavily wooded and in some places impenetrable. It was perfect terrain for a night attack by infiltrating infantry. It was also, if properly defended, a killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces began their assault. Unlike Ichiki's frontal charge, this represented a more sophisticated attack. Japanese infantry infiltrated through ravines on both sides of the ridge, attempting to envelop American positions. Small units probed for weak points. When they found them, larger forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts. The fighting was savage and confused. In darkness, Marines sometimes found themselves engaged in hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated to within grenade range. But defensive preparations held. When Japanese forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts, Marine mortars and artillery shattered them. The 11th Marines fired more than 2,000 rounds during the night, dropping high-explosive shells so close to Marine positions that shrapnel wounded friendly troops. Machine gun crews fired until barrels glowed red in darkness. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, anything that came to hand. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same scout who had warned of the Tenaru attack, moved through lines encouraging Marines and pointing out Japanese infiltration routes. Sergeant John Basilone manned a machine gun position that became critical to the defence, continuing to fight even after his gun crews were killed or wounded. By dawn on September 13th, Japanese attacks had pushed Marines back approximately half the ridge's length, forcing them to establish a new defensive line closer to Henderson Field. The situation appeared critical. General Vandergrift sent reinforcements, bringing the total defending force to approximately 2,500 men. Japanese forces would attack again that night, but this time Marines were ready with even stronger positions and more concentrated firepower. The second night's fighting proved even more intense than the first. Kawaguchi threw his remaining forces into desperate attempts to break through before American reinforcements made the position impregnable. Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly, dying by hundreds in machine gun fire. Some attacks came within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped. At one point, the situation was so desperate that Edson himself grabbed a rifle and joined the firing line. Again, American firepower and defensive preparation prevailed. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely collapsed. Japanese casualties were staggering. Approximately 830 to 850 Japanese soldiers died on and around what would forever be known as Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge. Marine casualties totaled approximately 104 killed and over 200 wounded between the Raider and Parachute battalions. The ridge had become a monument to the effectiveness of American defensive doctrine. For Japanese soldiers who survived, the battle represented another profound shock to their understanding of warfare. Captured diaries and post-war accounts consistently described the same realization. Japanese forces had expected to fight other infantry in darkness, where their training and spirit would triumph. Instead, they encountered artillery, machine guns, and mortars, all concentrated with precision they could not match. American commanders knew the Japanese were coming. They prepared killing zones. They waited for Japanese forces to enter those zones. Then they destroyed them with coordinated fire support. The battles at Tenaru and Bloody Ridge established patterns that would repeat throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces would launch attacks based on courage, night tactics, and close combat expertise. American forces would respond with overwhelming firepower, coordinated combined arms operations, and defensive positions carefully prepared to maximize their advantages. The outcome was predictable. Japanese casualties would be catastrophic. American casualties would be significant but sustainable. Numbers alone fail to capture the horror of jungle warfare on Guadalcanal. The environment itself became a weapon that killed impartially. Malaria infected nearly every man who spent more than a few weeks on the island. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division would report over 8,000 malaria cases. Tropical diseases disabled approximately 2/3 of the division. Dysentery was universal. Men suffered from fungal infections that ate through skin. Jungle rot caused open sores that never healed in humid heat. Dental problems with no treatment led to abscessed teeth and systemic infections. Japanese forces suffered even worse. Their supply situation meant inadequate food from the beginning. Soldiers were supposed to receive field rations, but the Tokyo Express could rarely deliver enough. Men subsisted on whatever they could forage, supplemented by occasional rice deliveries that had to be stretched impossibly thin. Starvation became a constant companion. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Quinine for malaria prevention ran out quickly and was never adequately resupplied. Wounded soldiers often died from infections that would have been easily treatable with proper medicine. Japanese documents captured later in the campaign painted a horrifying picture of conditions. A medical officer's report from late October noted that more than 60% of the 17th Army's forces on Guadalcanal were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition. Combat effectiveness had dropped to perhaps 30% of authorized strength. Soldiers were dying at a rate of 50 per day, most from starvation and disease rather than combat wounds. American supply lines, protected by Henderson Field aircraft during daylight hours, regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Shortages occurred, particularly in August and early September, when naval defeats left Marines temporarily cut off, but these were temporary. By October, the flow of supplies had become reliable. Marines ate canned rations that, while not appetizing, provided adequate calories and nutrition. Ammunition was plentiful enough that machine gunners could fire until barrels wore out, then request replacements. Medical care included field hospitals with surgical capabilities, plasma for blood transfusions, sulfur drugs for infection, and eventual evacuation of serious cases to rear-area hospitals. Japanese logistics consisted of whatever could be carried on destroyer decks or infiltrated through American lines. Soldiers learned to make a single rice ball last an entire day. Ammunition was conserved to the point that orders often restricted fire to only when absolutely necessary. Medical care meant a bandage if you were lucky, amputation without anesthesia if you were unlucky, or death if your wound became infected. Seriously wounded soldiers were often given grenades and left behind to commit suicide rather than burden their units or risk capture. In late October, Japanese forces mounted their largest offensive of the campaign. General Hyakutake himself came to Guadalcanal to personally command operations. He brought elements of the 2nd Division, including experienced troops from China. The plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the main effort coming from the south through dense jungle, similar to the Bloody Ridge approach. This time, however, Japanese forces would have more men, better coordination, and artillery support that had finally been delivered via destroyers. The offensive began on October 23rd, with a preliminary attack from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, rare on Guadalcanal because of difficulty transporting them, led an assault across the Matanikau River. American defenders, including elements of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the American Division, were ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank knocked out all 9 Japanese tanks in quick succession. The attack collapsed with heavy casualties. The main assault came on the night of October 24th into the 25th. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the south, hoping to break through American lines south of Henderson Field. They faced 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The fighting that night became legendary in Marine Corps history. Japanese attacks came in waves throughout the night. Individual breakthroughs were sealed by immediate counterattacks. Machine gunners fired until their weapons failed, then grabbed rifles and continued fighting. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions that landed within yards of Marine positions. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington stood by ready to provide naval gunfire support if called upon. At one critical moment, only a single Marine battalion stood between Japanese forces and Henderson Field. But they did not break. Fire discipline held. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed. General Nasu was dead, killed by machine gun fire during one of the night attacks. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers died in the attempt to break through. American casualties were several hundred killed and wounded, severe but sustainable. October 1942 also saw major naval engagements that decisively shifted the balance of power around Guadalcanal. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days from November 12th through 15th, saw some of the most intense surface combat in naval history. In a confused nighttime melee on November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force that included battleships Hiei and Kirishima. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the only 2 American flag officers killed in World War II surface engagements, died in the fighting. Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. 3 more destroyers were damaged, but Japanese forces lost the battleship Hiei, disabled in night action and sunk by aircraft the following day. More importantly, the bombardment mission failed. Henderson Field remained operational. On the night of November 14th into the 15th, battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment but was intercepted by USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a devastating display of American radar-directed gunnery, Washington put 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely see their target. Kirishima sank with heavy loss of life. Perhaps most significantly, American aircraft and surface ships destroyed a Japanese convoy attempting to land the 38th Division with heavy equipment. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and these were destroyed by aircraft and artillery before they could fully unload. Japanese casualties from the convoy exceeded 5,000 men. This was the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force. For Japanese troops already on the island, November marked the beginning of the end. They had expected reinforcement and resupply. Instead, they learned that naval battles had failed, that convoys were destroyed, that no more help was coming. Rations were reduced again. Already starving men were told to survive on even less. Medical supplies that had been critically short became non-existent. The sick and wounded filled makeshift field hospitals where doctors could do nothing except watch men die. Captured Japanese diaries from this period painted a picture of slow collapse. Entries described rice rations reduced to 1 ball per day, disease spreading everywhere, bodies burned when soldiers had the strength, the realization that no more supplies were coming, men eating grass and bark, deaths from poisonous plants, the deterioration of soldiers into desperate, starving shadows. December brought the final reckoning. Japanese command at Rabaul made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. They could not admit defeat publicly, but privately they recognized that continuing operations meant complete destruction of the 17th Army. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained on the island, down from a peak strength of 36,000. Of those 11,000, perhaps 7,000 were fit enough to walk. The rest were sick, wounded, or so weakened by starvation that they could barely crawl. The evacuation, designated Operation KE, would be one of the most successful Japanese operations of the entire war. Using destroyer runs similar to the Tokyo Express, Japanese naval forces extracted 10,652 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. It was a remarkable achievement under difficult circumstances, but it could not disguise the magnitude of defeat. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal reached a peak strength of approximately 36,000 personnel. Of these, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 died. About 14,800 killed in combat and 10,000 to 15,000 from disease and starvation. American casualties were also severe but sustainable. Marines and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. But American industry and manpower could replace these losses. New divisions were already training. Ships and aircraft were being produced faster than they could be lost. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thought cannot be overstated. For the first time, Japanese forces had been defeated in sustained ground combat. Every offensive had failed. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactical doctrine had resulted in catastrophic casualties. The revelation that American forces were not only materially superior but also tactically competent, well-led, and capable of enduring terrible conditions shattered pre-war assumptions. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later wrote memoirs or were interviewed after the war consistently emphasized several themes. First, they had completely underestimated American fighting qualities. Second, the disparity in equipment and supplies was far greater than intelligence had suggested. Third, Japanese logistics were fundamentally inadequate for sustained operations against an enemy that controlled sea and air. Fourth, spiritual power and tactical skill were insufficient against systematic disadvantages in firepower and resources. Post-war accounts from Japanese veterans revealed a consistent assessment. They had believed they were superior warriors. They trained harder, accepted death more readily, mastered night fighting and close combat. But on Guadalcanal, they learned that war is decided by systems. Americans had systems for everything. Systems for supply, for medical care, for artillery support, for air coordination. Every system functioned. Japanese systems failed because they were never built properly in the first place. Japanese veterans who survived the campaign and were later interviewed provided detailed accounts that contradicted official Japanese explanations for defeat. They acknowledged that American forces fought superbly at night when defending prepared positions. They admitted Americans endured malaria, dysentery, and terrible conditions while maintaining combat effectiveness because logistics supported them. They recognized that American firepower was overwhelming, coordinated, and precisely delivered. A single American battalion had more effective firepower than an entire Japanese regiment. Technical aspects of American superiority were significant. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal fought with Arisaka bolt-action rifles requiring manual cycling between shots. American Marines initially carried M1903 Springfield rifles, also bolt-action, but supplemented by M1 Garand semi-automatic rifles as these became available. The Garand's 8-round capacity and semi-automatic operation provided advantages in firefights. Machine guns told an even starker story. The American M1917. One Browning was water-cooled and could sustain fire indefinitely as long as water and ammunition were available. Japanese machine guns, primarily the Type 96 and Type 99, were lighter and more portable but lacked sustained fire capability. In defensive positions, this difference was decisive. Artillery superiority was perhaps most significant. The 11th Marines operated M101A one-pack howitzers that could be broken down and transported through jungle terrain. These 75mm weapons provided responsive, accurate fire support. Forward observers with infantry units could call for fire missions and receive rounds within minutes. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal was limited, difficult to move through jungle, and chronically short of ammunition. Naval gunfire added another dimension that Japanese forces could not match. Destroyers and cruisers offshore could deliver bombardments on Japanese positions or provide responsive fire support for Marine ground units. Radio communication between shore-based observers and naval ships allowed precise targeting. Air power became increasingly dominant as the campaign progressed. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field under terrible conditions, gradually established air superiority over Guadalcanal. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted Japanese bomber raids. SBD Dauntless dive bombers struck Japanese positions, supply ships, and troop concentrations. Japanese air forces from Rabaul had to fly at extreme limits of their range, giving them minimal time over target. The final American ground offensive in January 1943 demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, now including both Marine and Army divisions, launched coordinated attacks that systematically reduced remaining Japanese positions. The offensive had overwhelming support from artillery, air power, and naval gunfire. Japanese resistance, while determined, was hampered by starvation, disease, and ammunition shortages. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that Japanese forces had evacuated. General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey, stating that Tokyo Express no longer had terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. 6 months of fighting had resulted in the first major American ground victory against Japan. More importantly, it established patterns and revealed truths that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. Lessons. Japanese survivors took from Guadalcanal were devastating to pre-war military doctrine. The myth of Japanese warrior superiority had been shattered. Individual courage and tactical skill were inadequate against systematic disadvantages. Night attacks and close combat, the hallmarks of Japanese tactical success in China, failed against American defensive positions. Supply and logistics were not secondary concerns, but fundamental requirements for sustained combat. Air and naval superiority determined outcomes on the ground. These lessons learned in blood and starvation on Guadalcanal should have fundamentally reformed Japanese military thinking. Some officers recognized the implications. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer who visited Guadalcanal during the campaign, wrote afterward that Japan needed to completely reassess its strategy. The Americans, he observed, were fighting an industrial war where material production determined outcomes. Japan could not win an industrial war against American productive capacity. But Japanese military culture, built on generations of tradition and recent victories, could not easily accept such fundamental revision. Official explanations for Guadalcanal blamed inadequate supplies, naval defeats, and unexpected strength of American defenses. It did not acknowledge that Japanese tactical doctrine itself was flawed, that the entire conception of warfare that had served Japan well against China was obsolete against a modern industrial opponent. Those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and were later captured, or who survived the war, became witnesses to a transformation they never expected. They had entered the campaign as confident warriors of an invincible empire. They left as starving, disease-ridden survivors of catastrophic defeat. Many later described Guadalcanal as the moment they first understood that Japan would lose the war. Post-war testimonies from Japanese veterans captured this psychological transformation. They acknowledged learning truths that leaders had hidden. Americans were not weak but overwhelmingly strong, not just in weapons, but in organization, logistics, leadership, and ability to sustain combat operations indefinitely. Japanese forces fought with courage and skill. It did not matter. American forces fought with systems and resources Japanese forces could not match. The American perspective on Guadalcanal emphasized different lessons. For Marines and soldiers who fought there, the campaign proved that American forces could match Japanese troops in the brutality of jungle combat. The mythology of Japanese invincibility was destroyed. American defensive doctrine worked. Combined arms coordination was effective. Individual American soldiers, properly trained and equipped, were more than capable of defeating Japanese forces. But Americans also learned respect for Japanese soldiers as tough, determined, skilled adversaries who would fight to death rather than surrender. The willingness of Japanese forces to continue attacking in face of hopeless odds, to endure starvation rather than give up, to die rather than retreat, made profound impressions. The contrast between the two sides' approaches to prisoner welfare and surrender illustrated fundamental cultural differences. American forces made efforts to encourage Japanese surrender, dropping leaflets, broadcasting radio messages, offering medical care and food to prisoners. These efforts had minimal success. Of approximately 36,000 Japanese troops who served on Guadalcanal, Fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, and most of those were too sick or wounded to resist. Strategic implications of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the island itself. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and eventual evacuation demonstrated that the Japanese defensive perimeter could be penetrated. Allied strategy shifted from defensive operations to offensive campaigns. Industrial and material advantages that America possessed could be translated into military victory if applied systematically. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end. Loss of experienced troops, pilots, and ships could not be replaced at anything approaching the rate America was producing new forces. The decision to evacuate admitted, however quietly, that Japan could not sustain attritional warfare against American industrial might. Veterans of Guadalcanal on both sides carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. American Marines and soldiers who survived became cadres for new units, passing along hard-won lessons about jungle warfare, defensive tactics, and combined arms coordination. The 1st Marine Division, pulled off Guadalcanal in December 1942, required months of rest and rehabilitation before returning to combat. Japanese survivors faced an even grimmer future. Those evacuated during Operation KE were dispersed to other units throughout the Pacific, carrying with them psychological burdens of defeat and knowledge that American forces were far more formidable than pre-war propaganda had suggested. Many would die in subsequent battles as Japan's strategic position continued to deteriorate. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore scars of 6 months of intense combat for decades afterward. Wrecked aircraft, destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and unexploded ordnance littered jungles and coastal areas. Henderson Field, expanded and improved during and after the campaign, served as a major Allied base for subsequent operations in the Solomons. For military historians and strategists, Guadalcanal provided case studies in amphibious operations, jungle warfare, logistics, air-ground coordination, and integration of naval power with land operations. The campaign demonstrated that modern warfare required more than brave soldiers and tactical superiority. It required industrial capacity, technological advantage, and ability to sustain operations over extended periods. The human cost of Guadalcanal was staggering on both sides. More than 7,000 American and Japanese servicemen died in naval battles around the island. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses exceeded 30,000 from all causes. Thousands more on both sides suffered from diseases and conditions that would affect their health for the rest of their lives. But strategic significance justified, in military terms, the terrible cost. Guadalcanal represented the turning point where Allied forces shifted from defense to offense in the Pacific. It demonstrated that Japan could be defeated in ground combat. It established air and naval superiority patterns that would characterize the rest of the war. The story of Japanese troops encountering American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal is ultimately a story about collision between two fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. One side believed in supremacy of warrior spirit, in courage overcoming material disadvantages, in tactics producing victory regardless of resources. The other side believed in systematic application of industrial power, in logistics and firepower as force multipliers, in combined arms coordination as key to success. The jungle of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these conflicting philosophies met. The outcome, though it took 6 months of brutal fighting to reach its inevitable conclusion, demonstrated that concentrated fire support and logistics, when combined with competent tactics and determined soldiers, created a form of military power that Japanese forces simply could not match. For Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and lived to tell their stories, the campaign represented the moment when reality destroyed illusion. They learned that their training had been based on false assumptions, their tactics had been designed for a different kind of war, their logistics had been inadequate from the beginning, and their nation was engaged in a conflict it could not win through military means alone. Americans who fought on Guadalcanal learned different but equally important lessons. they discovered they could match Japanese soldiers in brutality of combat. They proved that American industrial power could be translated into military victory. They developed tactics and doctrine for jungle warfare that would serve them well in subsequent campaigns. And they shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, replacing it with realistic assessment of a tough, determined, but ultimately defeatable enemy. Guadalcanal was where Japanese troops were terrified not by American soldiers as individual fighters, though they proved formidable, but by the systematic, overwhelming, relentless application of firepower and material resources that American forces brought to every engagement. It was terror born not from fear of death, which Japanese soldiers had been trained to accept, but from realization that courage and sacrifice were meaningless against an enemy whose supplies never ran out, whose wounded received care, whose artillery never stopped firing, whose aircraft controlled the skies, and whose industrial base could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The transformation that began when Japanese forces first encountered American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal marked a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. From that point forward, Japanese forces would be on the defensive, fighting a losing battle against an enemy whose material advantages grew larger with each passing month. The jungle warfare of Guadalcanal became the template for future campaigns, proving that American forces could fight and win in the most difficult terrain against a determined enemy, provided they had adequate logistics, effective coordination, and overwhelming firepower.